Hi, Dr. Razzo, and to anybody else watching, welcome to my presentation about child development and the different parental styles that affect a child's development. I appreciate you being here, and let's get started. The first style we'll be talking about today is called the authoritarian parenting style. It's characterized with restrictive and punitive actions taken by the parents towards the child. The parents exert high control over the child while offering low affection. Rules are enforced, but they're rarely explained why, which it's important to explain to a child why something exists so that they can not just follow the rules, but understand why it's important to do so, right? And the expectations for the child are quite high to the point where the child might never reach those expectations. So authoritarian parents, they might physically abuse their children, through things like spanking and whatnot. They might emotionally abuse their children by, attacking their self-esteem and, things like that. And they embrace coercion. So they try to get the child to do things through means that are maybe not exactly ethical, right? They also believe that punishment will always result in the desired behavior. And that's just not the case. According to one study, they find that punishment produces desired outcomes in the short term, sure, but in the long term, it causes problems for the child. A famous example of this is the film Matilda. It's actually one of my favorite films. I watched it quite a bit of times when I was a kid. Dane DeVito, he plays a authoritarian parent that does a lot of questionable things, especially towards Matilda, and it makes her lash out in some ways. And it's a film, so there's like psychic powers and stuff like that. But that's a very good example of an authoritarian parent style for sure. Now, given what I just talked about, one might assume that there's rarely any benefits towards authoritarian parenting, but that's just not the case. There are some benefits in certain contexts. So the pros are short-term obedience. And it's useful in emergency situations. So if you want to get your child to do something, sometimes gentle nudge is not the right way to do it. You have to, forcefully get him to do it. This is good in, like I said, in emergency situations where the child is about to be in danger. Let's say they're trying to cross the street and, a car is coming. So you try to you might use an angry tone to get their attention, right? Boundaries are made clear for authoritarian parents. The rules are usually pretty clear because they're often always enforced and always told, to the child, like, hey, don't do this, you do that, right? And rules are respected despite being not understood. The child will unconditionally respect the rules because they're afraid of being punished. The cons, long-term consequences, of which we will get into later on, it does have an increased chance of the child rebelling. If you push and you push and you push, eventually the child's going to lash out. That anger has to go somewhere, and it strains the child and parent relationship for obvious reasons. There's going to be a lot of tension when children are forced to follow rules with no reason knowing why often, right? So what are some of the behaviors exhibited by children of authoritarian parents? Well, researchers conducted a study with 218 mother-daughter pairs, and they found that maternal emotional dysregulation predicts authoritarian parenting style, which in turn predicted adolescent emotional dysregulation. In layman's terms, that means that if a mother has problems coping with her own emotions, she might embrace an authoritarian parenting style, which might seem like an easier path than something like authoritative, which we will get into later, which this in turn is externalized onto the child, and the child in turn becomes emotionally distant. They might, show more aggression and stuff like that. As a matter of fact, there's another literature review that was conducted by Mossad and others, and they found that authoritarian parenting styles do lead to aggressive behavior in children when compared to other styles. So what are some of the outcomes of a child that grows up from having, authoritarian parents, right? There's a couple studies we're going to be going over. The first one finds that as these children become young adults, they have problems adjusting to their emotions, they have problems at the home, and they have problems regulating their health. Another study finds that those that were raised by authoritarian parents had less effective coping strategies when it comes to homesickness. And this concept could be, applied to other aspects of coping that might be required throughout their life too, right? If they have problems with homesickness, what about when like a pet dies or something like that? You know what I mean? And then another study with Chinese students finds that those that were from authoritarian homes, they had higher levels of aggression and worse scores of self-concept and social and emotional competence. And they actually said that the parental warmth that other parenting styles might have, that lacks in an authoritarian parent, and that's what causes these issues among children that grow up. So the next parenting style is called the authoritative parenting style. Sounds very similar to authoritarian, but it is the word itself is a combination of authoritarian and maybe like permissive, right? So authoritative is kind of a combination of the two. And the style itself reflects that as well, because this style tries to balance the best parts of authoritarian parenting and permissive parenting. There's a low to mid level of control depending on the context, which we'll get into later. But there's a high level of affection, right? Always. Rules are enforced and they're explained why. And there's a significant effort is required on the parent's part, because this style requires constant effort, a little bit of nuance, creativity, and pragmatism. So let's continue and see what has in store for this style. So authoritative parents, they provide the child with a sense of autonomy that promotes curiosity and creativity. They know where to draw the line and where freedom should be restricted. A good example of this is Merlin in Finding Nemo. Classic film, I love it. At first, Merlin is authoritarian. He tries to keep his child in a tight leash, so to speak, so that they can't go in too far. But this causes Nemo to get lost, and eventually Merlin finds Nemo. And as they kind of both grow, Merlin eventually adopts the authoritative parenting style, where he's more reasonable and he's kind of a little bit more enlightened in terms of his approach towards parenting. So what are the pros and cons of this style? Well, the pros are, which is perhaps the most important, is a healthy parent and child relationship. This can cause a ripple effect to have so many benefits for the child and the parent's life. It promotes confidence in children. Communication remains open, so the child always feels that there's someone to talk to, which is very important, especially in these times with the internet and isolation becoming a increasingly bigger issue for people. Rules are respected because they are understood, not because they seek to escape some kind of punishment, right? Which I think is a better approach. The cons are that the parent has to provide consistent effort to enforce this style. It's ineffective in certain cultures and is frowned upon, so that might make it less effective. And parents have to remain committed. With increasing divorce rates in the United States and elsewhere, it's increasingly difficult for parents to be committed to their children when a lot of the times they have to be also committed to their partner, right? So what are some of the outcomes of a child that grows up with authoritative parents? Their coping styles for homesickness, in contrast to the last style, was actually better. Authoritative parenting styles have better overall academic outcomes. One study found that, however, it does increase the risk of risky behaviors in the children, as they have more freedom. They have more freedom to make mistakes and to, engage in some behaviors that might not be productive, right? Like gambling, substance use disorder, stuff like that. They're at higher risk of that. And finally, the flexibility in authoritative parents, it minimizes aggression in children and negative behavior outcomes, according to a pretty comprehensive systematic literature review. So before I spoke about some of the behaviors of children with these types of parents, now we're going to go over to some of the later results that they have. One study finds that early weight gain in children predicts later weight gain, when they grow up. And one study finds that those with authoritative parenting styles had healthier eating habits, which continued, throughout later on. And while it's not the case for all cultures, authoritative parenting is related to overall better academic achievement, lower levels of angry distress, and better school adjustment overall. And finally, this parenting style is widely considered to be the best, at least to overall better outcomes for children later in life, since they can mature, they learn from their mistakes, their fears, and they're not afraid to be punished for expressing creativity and just trying to use their imagination, right? This is the next parenting style, which in my opinion happens to be the worst, and we'll see why. This is the neglectful / uninvolved parent. This parent has a whatever goes style, if you could even call it a style, because there is no real approach that these parents have towards their children. They kind of just have a child and let them do whatever they want. Low control, low affection, low to none for both of these, if you ask me. Rules are non-existent and they're rarely, if ever, enforced. The child can do whatever they want, and if they make a mistake, they won't even know that they did. There's virtually no expectations for the child either. So how are they going to achieve their goals if they can't set them, right? If there's no one there to guide them. So one of the most famous examples, and one of my favorite films growing up, was Home Alone. The child is an 8-year-old kid that's literally left behind. His parents forget he exists. So that is probably the highest form of neglect right there, is to just be so indifferent towards your child that you somehow forget they exist. I mean, I know it's a film, but I'm sure this does actually happen in the real world. So what are some pros and cons about this parenting style? Well, just at a first glance, you can see there's not many pros, if any, if you can even call it that. There's one where the children can show potential towards resiliency. Through their hardship of having to essentially grow up on their own, they find a sense of strength sometimes, not always, and it's usually because they had to, not because they wanted to, right? And here is the long list of cons, many of which you could probably, that are not on here that you can imagine. Emotional neglect, minimal interaction by the parents, lack of supervision, behavioral problems for the children and probably from the parents as well, mental health concerns for the child, academic struggles, impaired decision making, low self-esteem, and then difficulty in establishing future relationships for the child, which can cause a cascade of different issues. So what are some of the behaviors that children of neglectful parents engage in? Well, they are more at risk of doing those risky behaviors similar to authoritative parenting, because here there is no control, there is no rule setting. Substance use disorder is a higher risk. They might engage in gambling, stuff like that. Dysfunctional parenting is linked to aggression between parents and their children. So if a child is continuously neglected, they might build up anger and resentment, and they might lash out towards their parents, causing a strain on that relationship, if you could even call it that, due to neglect, right? And then these children might build resilience out of necessity. They might exhibit behaviors that make them look stronger, even though they might not be, or they might actually be strong, but that's not because they decided to be, it's because they were forced to be by their environment. So what are some later outcomes for children when they grow up? Well, they face serious challenges, less effective coping strategies, academic struggle, and they can't maintain social relationships probably because of that neglect. Neglectful parenting is associated with higher levels of externalizing problems. So they might, it's that classic example of a dad coming home from work and, lashing out at the mother and the child because they had a bad day at work or something like that. This children of neglectful parents probably have a higher likelihood of projecting that anger onto others and negative emotions onto others, right? Instead of trying to focus on where that comes from, really. According to one comprehensive meta-analysis, these children grow up to be socially incompetent, they have lower self-esteem, are immature, and are alienated from the family. So if I had to guess, that neglectful practice has a feedback effect where as the parents neglect the child neglects their parents, and they become ostracized, basically. And finally, the last style we'll be talking about today is the permissive/indulgent parenting style. Rules are rarely, if ever, enforced, somewhat similar to the the style we previously talked about, avoiding them and neglecting the child. There's a low amount of control, similar to neglect, but there's a high amount of affection. So the child has great autonomy with little or no guidance. They can do whatever they want, and the parents are basically just yes men, just sitting there and be like, yep, well, sure, why not, right? There's little to no expectations for the child. Little goals are set because I guess in the parent's mind, the child is so pure and good that maybe there is no need for improvement. I don't know, but let's see some good examples of what this style consists of. So another good movie example, and it's funny that all of these movies are from my childhood, is the parents of Veruca Salt in Willy Wonka. You can see her smiling here, and these parents gave her everything she ever wanted at a whim, with no questions asked. This is the definition of a spoiled child. This is what people mean when they say a child is spoiled. They were raised by parents who were incredibly permissive, indulgent. In the seven deadly sins, there's the gluttony, right? So these parents basically feed that gluttony. When she demands nuts in the film from these squirrels, the squirrels say no, and they call her a bad nut, and she's thrown down the garbage chute. That was her consequences. And in the film, she eventually learns, Veruca, that she might have been spoiled, and she learns a little bit of a lesson there. Unfortunately, the parents don't, though, if I remember correctly. So what are some pros and cons of this style? Well, the pros are the parents are nurturing. There's a high amount of affection there. There's open communication, typically. The parents are receptive to what the child wants at all times, right? And the children have great autonomy, great freedom. They can do whatever they want. On the downside, there's a lack of boundaries, so the child can get in some pretty bad danger. Children are prone to accidents. Let's just say that. And children, they might make poor decisions based on a lack of guidance. They don't know what's right, what's wrong. They lack that moral structure that parents are supposed to provide. And there's going to be some emotional development issues. When you're constantly given what you want, you might be like her and say, I want it now. And then when you don't get what you want, well, you're not used to that, right? So what are some behaviors of children with these types of parents? Well, according to one study, they find that a high allowance of risky behavior does increase that chances of gambling and substance use disorder, as we mentioned earlier. Similar to authoritative, where if there's too much freedom, they might, and the neglectful style as well, too much freedom results in higher chances of risky behavior. They did have better coping strategies for things like homesickness compared to authoritarian or uninvolved parents. And permissive parenting can lead to unhealthy eating habits, which does make sense, right? Because if a child asks for something, they're going to give it, the parents are going to give it to them. If they don't want something, the parents won't give it to them. So when the parents, are trying to give them broccoli and the child says, ew, no, they'll just be like, okay, fine. And that's it. That'll be the end of it. So not good. So how do these children grow up? Well, according to one study, again, that risky behavior can result in substance use disorder and gambling addiction later in life. Since they're at a higher risk of unhealthy eating habits, obesity is likely on the horizon for these children as they grow up. Extensive freedom gives them more autonomy, so that children can create their own schedules. Now, if they fail to do this, this habit could continue later in life, which could be a problem in our structured world, right? And lastly, they do typically have good self-esteem, and social issues or social skills are okay, but they're impulsive, selfish, they lack self-regulation, they're very egotistical. They think they are the main character of the world because that's how their parents raised them, right? And that could also be problems later on in life when you have to, learn your place basically, and when you're dealt a bad hand, right? These children might have problems adapting to those kind of situations. Thank you, Dr. Razzo, for watching. I hope you enjoyed some of my examples. I'm going to provide the reference sheet now. There is quite a bit here, so I couldn't fit it all really. I will also be including this in the summary to anyone that's interested. Once again, thank you for watching, and I hope you have a great day.